Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're going to begin. I'm Arnie Eisen. I want to welcome you all to JTS and to the Henry N. and Selma S. Rapaport Memorial Lecture. We're now going to engage in the collective ritual of silencing our cell phones, which I'm going to be the first to do. And I want to say that to those of you here for the first time, welcome to JTS. I hope you'll come back, especially come back later this year to see the opening of the new buildings, which are right outside this window. Some of you may not know the dorms, as of 10 days ago, are occupied by our students, and the rest of the new buildings will open up sequentially in the next 6 to 8 weeks. There's a grand opening ceremony to which you're all invited on March 22nd, and we hope you'll come to a series of events throughout the year that we're going to have to celebrate the new building. I also, aside from welcoming you, I want to welcome the live stream viewers. It's wonderful that we're able to share this with you, and some people have gathered together at various synagogues to witness and talk about this program, so I especially want to welcome B'nai Israel congregation in Rockville, Maryland, Malvern Jewish Center in Malvern, New York, Adath Israel, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and all the others who are joining us. And finally, it's my great pleasure and honor to be able to present the speakers whom you're going to meet and hear from in a few moments. Dr. Samuel Sternberg, Dr. Paul Root Wolpe, and Dr. Laurie Zoloth. Their topic this evening is gene editing and the transformation of human life, perspectives from Jewish ethics. Let me say a word about the topic before I say a little more about Henry N. and Selma Rapaport and the Rapaport Lecture. JTS has been concerned with ethics for a very long time. Some of you may not know there used to be an Institute of Ethics at JTS named for Herbert Raymond, the governor of New York, who was also a member of the JTS board and a prominent donor of JTS. And more relevantly to this topic, Louis Finkelstein in the late 1930s, I think it was 1938, established something called the Conference on Science, Philosophy, and Religion, which brought together some of the leading thinkers from a variety of faiths and a variety of disciplines. We sometimes met at JTS, sometimes at Columbia, up the street, to talk about issues that were of great importance in the day. It's hard to imagine an issue of greater importance in our day than the gene editing process, which offers all sorts of new possibilities and offers all sorts of new dilemmas. You may have seen the book, A Crack in Creation, one of the authors of which, Samuel Sternberg, is among our speakers this evening. And the authors say there, Sam Sternberg and Jennifer Doudna, that CRISPR technology, quote, offers both the greatest promise and arguably the greatest peril for the future of humanity. It's our conviction at JTS that Jewish tradition can and must address issues of this magnitude, and therefore it's a great pleasure for me to do this evening, and I'm especially happy that this is the Rapaport Memorial Lecture, because I can't tell you how many times Michael Rapaport and I have conversed about the importance of ethics in our tradition, and Michael has sponsored an ethics program. It's your alma mater, right? Union College. And we've talked about the importance of JTS getting into this arena more and talking and teaching and acting about ethical issues. And now we have a new framework for that in the Steve and Ruth Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice at JTS, which was established this past spring. And this lecture this evening is co-sponsored by the Hendel Center. So the annual lecture, the Rapaport Lecture, was originally endowed in 1982 by Mrs. Selma S. Rapaport, Zichronah Livracha, a past president of the Women's League for Conservative Judaism, of course sitting in the Women's League synagogue that was the money for which was contributed by the Women's League for Conservative Judaism. And Selma was a longtime member of the JTS board. She contributed this fund in memory of her husband, Henry N. Rapaport. Henry N. Rapaport was a distinguished attorney and committed Jew. He served as president of Temple Israel Center in White Plains, of which there's a whole delegation joining us here this evening, and later as president of the United Synagogue. He was an active member of the JTS board and a generous benefactor of JTS's scholarly programs. So I'm pleased to recognize the presence this evening of Henry and Selma Rapaport's sons, Michael with his wife Joanne, and David with his wife Deborah, as well as other family members and friends who are joining us. We thank the Rapaport family for its generous support over the years and for this lecture, which I am personally really looking forward to. And it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay to formally introduce the program and the speakers. Rabbi Ruskay is Associate Dean of JTS's Rabbinical School, Associate Director of the Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies, and Executive Director of our new Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's program. Thank you all for being here. Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay.
Thank you, Chancellor Eisen. Welcome. It's nice to be here tonight with all of you. I'm sorry? Nice. Oh, all right. Excellent. Thank you. The Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice is committed to fostering academic, religious, and activist engagement in Jewish ethics. Together with the Rapaport family and also with Arizona State University and Georgette Bennett in memory of Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, we're really pleased to have you here with us tonight to talk for an evening of discussion about gene editing and the transformation of human life. I want to introduce you to our speakers. We have Samuel Sternberg, who runs a research laboratory at Columbia University, where he's an assistant professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biophysics. His research focuses on RNA-guided bacterial immune systems and on the development of these systems for genome engineering. His work has been published in the journals Nature, Science, and Cell, and been covered in the New York Times, Science News, and The Scientist, among others. An invited speaker internationally, he's actively involved in public discussions on the ethical issues surrounding gene editing. Together with Dr. Jennifer Doudna, as you heard, he co-authored A Crack in Creation, a popular science book about the discovery, development, and applications of CRISPR, gene editing technology, which received an enthusiastic review from the Wall Street Journal, New York Review of Books, and many other outlets. We have Dr. Paul Root Wolpe, who is the Raymond Schinazi Distinguished Research Chair in Jewish Bioethics, Professor of Medicine, Psychiatry, Pediatrics, Neuroscience, and Sociology, and the Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. He served for 17 years as a bioethicist for NASA. I hope you'll talk about that. Widely published, his work focuses on the social, religious, ethical, and ideological impact of medicine and technology on the human condition. He also speaks on Jewish thought. He's the bioethics advisor to JScreen, which promotes preconception genetic carrier screening among Jews, and was a major contributor to a guide to Jewish end-of-life issues, B'choref Hayamim, in the winter of life. Hayamim. Chosen by the Teaching Company as a superstar teacher of America, his popular TED Talk has reached over 1.5 million views. A frequent commentator in broadcast and print media, he's been featured on 60 Minutes. Dr. Laurie Zoloth is the Margaret E. Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics in the Divinity School and the Senior Advisor to the Provost for Programs on Social Ethics at the University of Chicago. A leader in the fields of religious studies with particular interest in bioethics and Jewish studies. Her research explores religion and ethics, drawing from sources ranging from biblical and Talmudic texts to postmodern Jewish philosophy, including the writings of Emmanuel Levinas. Her scholarship spans the ethics of genetic engineering, stem cell research, synthetic biology, social justice, and healthcare, and how science and medicine are taught. She's the author of Healthcare and the Ethics of Encounter, a Jewish discussion of social justice, and co-editor of 5 books, including Jews and Genes, The Genetic Future in Contemporary Jewish Thought. Our program will proceed as follows. After the presentations, our speakers will engage in conversation moderated by Dr. Yonatan Brafman to expand on a number of key points. Dr. Brafman is Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics at JTS, Director of the Program of Jewish Ethics here, and the Academic Director of our Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice. After their conversation, we'll invite questions and comments from you. So I now happily call on Dr. Samuel Sternberg to begin. Thank you.
So I want to start by thanking JTS and the organizers for giving me a chance to speak here today. I just was talking with Yoni, discovered that we're both class of 07 at Columbia College, but I'm embarrassed to say that I've not once stepped foot in this building before tonight, so it's finally good to have an excuse to be here. So as the kind of token scientist on the panel, I really wanted to focus most of my remarks on bringing everyone up to speed on what is gene editing and where is this technology at today. So imagine you're writing an essay or an email on your computer, and you make a typo. You want to fix the typo, you go in, you press backspace, or maybe you drag across the word, select it, delete it, and type in the new word to replace the original misspelling. Gene editing is essentially a set of tools or technologies that is enabling us to use those same kinds of commands on the language of the genome, of the language of life, DNA inside of all of the cells that use DNA as their genetic code. So CRISPR is the name of the latest and greatest technology that enables gene editing. I do want to stress it's not the first gene editing technology, but whereas the previous methods that researchers had developed to rewrite DNA inside of cells were extremely expensive and extremely impractical to use, the development and discovery of CRISPR has really revolutionized biology, biotechnology, and landed us in this conversation today about what we do with these incredible technologies and how to make sure that we push them to really improve society. Just 30 seconds on what is CRISPR. So the term stands for clustered, regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. That's all I'm going to say about what those words are. But in short, CRISPR was not invented. It was discovered in bacteria. CRISPR is actually something found in nature, but it was fundamental basic research performed at MIT, at Harvard, at Berkeley, in Spain, in the Netherlands, all around the world that led to an understanding of how bacteria use CRISPR to ward off viral infections and led to the discovery of the molecules that enable this immune response, and that ultimately revealed a new way of using those molecules in human cells for gene editing. So in the simplest sense, it's a find and replace method or find and replace technology for recognizing precise locations in the DNA of a cell and making precise targeted changes. Now, why is that important? Well, as scientists, we often are trying to understand what about the DNA in a cell leads to the emergent traits of the organism, and what kinds of mutations or mistakes in that code cause disease, cause genetic diseases like sickle cell or beta thalassemia, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's. These are all monogenic genetic diseases whose origins are found in mutations in DNA. And the revolutionary idea with a technology like CRISPR is really to develop tools to recognize those mistaken bits of code and repair those mistakes at the level of DNA as a new way of treating disease. I do want to comment that gene editing has ramifications far broader than just human disease. And in fact, if you come up to the Columbia Medical Center or go down to the main campus over here, you're going to find hundreds of researchers using CRISPR just to understand the kind of amazing awe in biology. What about a cell's DNA leads to these emergent phenomena? And so in basic research, CRISPR is quickly becoming one of the most powerful tools for researchers to manipulate the genome as a way of studying nature. In agriculture, CRISPR is quickly being developed to generate improved crops that may one day allow us to grow plants in areas of the world that are suffering from climate change. I think if we had more time, we could talk about some of the very interesting regulatory challenges that the use of gene editing will bring to the world of agriculture. But I think what we'll probably spend most of our time today focusing on are the opportunities to use gene editing for treating human disease, and of course, the possibilities to use CRISPR not just in patients with disease, but the earliest point of human development, the fertilization of an egg cell with sperm, and the use of CRISPR in fertilized embryos. So first I want to talk about where we're at today with the use of CRISPR in patients to treat genetic disease. And I'd like to stress that although the very profound question of using gene editing in embryos has garnered much of the public's attention on this new technology, it's something that very few researchers in the world are actually seeking to develop. I'd say 99+% of researchers using CRISPR in a therapeutic context have the dream to use this in patients living with disease today for treating disease. And where are we at today? So modifying disease-causing mutations in a laboratory in Petri dish cell culture, we can essentially target almost any mutation we'd like that causes disease and repair those mutations. The next big challenge, and this won't be an easy one, is how to deliver CRISPR into patient cells inside of a living organism, namely the human patient. And this is going to be a long, multi-year process of developing the kinds of delivery tools that would allow researchers to deliver different formulations of CRISPR into patients in a safe way. Just earlier this week, there were promising news released from two of the major companies developing CRISPR-based therapies that provided the first results from two patients treated with CRISPR who had sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia. And I think these early glimpses are that these initial attempts have already shown success. In the case of one of the patients who previously had required up to 16 blood transfusions per year, he has now become transfusion independent after this first dose of gene-edited cells. So the dream is really to bring these kinds of treatments to more and more patients around the world and to move beyond just blood disorders, but to treat more complex genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis and hopefully eventually neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Huntington's disease. Nevertheless, solving the issues and the complications around delivery are going to take, again, extensive research and development, and I think we're really just at the beginnings of this process to realize the dream of these new kinds of genetic medicines. A number of years ago, I was approached by an entrepreneur, if you want to call her that, in the Bay Area, who reached out to me because she had founded a company called Happy Healthy Baby. She was interested in using CRISPR not in patients, but in human embryos for the purposes of eliminating disease-causing mutations before life even begins. And this was my first exposure to the idea of CRISPR being applied in the so-called germline, the cells like eggs, sperm, or embryonic stem cells, which would importantly not only affect the resulting individual, but also pass on those gene edits, those DNA changes to all future generations. And this is where we get the term the germline, because of this continuous line that connects one generation to the next through germ cells. And at the time that I was approached by this woman, it was actually pretty clear how you might do this, technically speaking, because we had already, and I say we, the community, developed methods for directly injecting CRISPR molecules into fertilized embryos from mice and from non-human primates. Now that work has proceeded because developing animal models for disease is going to be one of the key stepping stones to realize gene therapies for patients. But in a world where microinjection of material into embryos is happening every day in human in vitro fertilization clinics, it became clear to myself, to Jennifer Doudna, and many other researchers in the field that this question that has been plaguing scientists and ethicists for decades, that of manipulating life at the earliest stage of human development, would no longer be just the stuff of science fiction, but would now be possible today with CRISPR technology, when for the first time the tools to make precise changes to the genome exist. And so in 2015, the first two position papers on the use of CRISPR in the germline, in the human germline, were published, one by a group of authors, of which I was a part, the second by another group of authors, and these two position papers essentially wanted to call attention to this growing controversy and ensure that this discussion about how or whether to even move forward in this direction would live not just inside of science and the kind of siloed academic environment, but that this discussion would happen in a public forum in a way that all the relevant stakeholders should begin to take part in the conversation. We had hoped that this conversation would precede active development of CRISPR technologies in human embryos. Unfortunately, that has not been the case until now. In 2015, that same year, the first publications came out that tested CRISPR in non-viable human embryos. A couple years later, the first study from the United States was published that used CRISPR in viable human embryos and showed for the first time that using the microinjection of CRISPR and sperm in egg cells, that one could actually achieve clinically relevant efficiencies without side effects such as off-target mutations or mosaicism, which really pushed the technology further and further into a situation where it might be safe enough to use in a clinical setting. However, the ethical situation, the ethical issues still hadn't really been adequately discussed. Unfortunately, this continued to proceed, and we just passed the 1-year anniversary of the first reports from a scientist in China that actually 2 babies were born last year whose genomes had been modified at the embryo level using CRISPR. This act was resulted in a huge backlash from across the scientific and non-scientific communities. We could get into the details of what the scientists did later, but I think one can look at a number of failures of this experiment from an ethical perspective, from a safety perspective, from a lack of transparency perspective. And I think what was most disappointing is that the kind of goal to have this public dialogue to precede any clinical uses of human embryo editing did not succeed in stopping someone from moving forward anyway. And so that's where we are today. This technology is out there. It is relatively easy to use, which means physicians that do in vitro fertilization can gain access to the molecules that they need to do germline gene editing. In fact, the Chinese researcher that carried out this work purchased the molecules from 2 public companies that sell these CRISPR reagents to researchers anywhere in the world. And so this is the challenge. This technology is no longer so complicated that it can't happen unless only the most specialized of research institutions pursue it. It's something that a scientist who's interested, that has the right access to embryos, could in theory move forward clinically. And so I think this has really intensified the urgency to have these discussions openly about how to proceed. Do we need regulations? Do we need moratoria? How can we reach the kinds of international consensus that we'd really like to avoid medical tourism, where researchers might pursue these applications in countries where there are no regulations and try to skirt existing legislation? So we have some folks in the audience that have been major voices in prescribing how the community can move forward. The World Health Organization has set up an independent expert panel to advise on the oversight and governance of human gene editing. There are separate commissions comprising bodies from the United States, the National Academies of Science and Medicine, Britain's Royal Society, who are slated to publish a report next year. And so I think where I feel this is moving is we need to really move towards not having a patchwork of distinct regulations or prescriptions from different bodies around the world, but see if we can arrive at some kind of unified message that will prevent the development of this technology from having these surprises that disappoint or that may have not followed the kinds of guidelines that many of us would hope. But I don't want to end on the negative, because I think although we did write this line, actually I forgot the quote that you read, it sounded too alarmist actually when you read it, because I think CRISPR is really, any technology can be pushed in a positive way or a negative way. I think you could look at smartphone technology, nuclear technology. Any of these technologies can be used for good or bad. And I think CRISPR has amazing potential to improve our world. And I think it has incredible potential in a human therapeutic setting to really treat cancers and treat diseases in a fundamentally different way. But we need to not be scared to tackle these big ethical questions, and I'm hopeful that the next 2 speakers, who I think are true experts in the area, are gonna help us get there. So thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. This conversation that we're going to have today is a conversation that we have been holding in one way or another for decades. It's not a new conversation. The conversations around what we would do when we began to have the technology to manipulate the human genome, the animal genome, plant genomes, not only has been going on for decades in general, it's been going on for many decades in the Jewish community. Laurie and I have been involved in this for at least 40 years ourselves, and we had meetings back in the 90s where we discussed this as a Jewish community. What's new is that it's happening now. It's on the verge of happening in a wide way that before was more theoretical. So does that change anything? There is a paradox about that. There's a difference between anticipation and actuality, between prediction and its realization. And our predictions of how things are going to roll out are often wrong. They go astray. They miss important consequences. So we need to wait, in one sense, to understand the realities of technologies as they emerge. On the other hand, if you wait for a technology to actualize itself, you've missed the opportunity to direct its development. So that dance between anticipating technologies and controlling technologies is always a kind of difficult one. And the way in which you try to control it is by trying to control the context, the social context, the language, the way in which we conceptualize not only particular technologies, but the role of technology in general. I think Jews have a particular standing in that conversation and have had for a long time for three reasons. First, because we have a multi-millennia conversation about the nature of health, illness, corporeality, living in the world as embodied beings, that is a font of wisdom that can be drawn from when we confront biotechnological challenges. Second, because simply in our numbers, we are highly oversampled in medicine, in health, in technology, and in ethics. Those are some of the fields that Jews naturally go to, and so our voice is particularly strong in those areas simply because we populate them so strongly. And finally, unfortunately, because our history as a population targeted and systematically attacked as genetically flawed, beginning long before its tragic culmination in the Shoah, gives us both a historical wisdom and the legitimacy to put forth our genetic concerns in a particularly strong and convincing way. So the question that we want to ask is a robust one, and there are many, many approaches, and there are many ways I could have structured this talk, but as an opportunity to talk about it in this Jewish context, I'm going to try to take a particularly Jewish slant on this. The question of how and under what circumstances and how we conceptualize intervening in the human being for genetics is a profound one. First, let's talk about some of the things Sam referred to, which is intervening in a healthy adult in order to try to cure a disease that has a genetic basis in that adult without the possibility, or at least with the high probability, of not passing that on to offspring just within the somatic body of that person. Now that's a very strong value in Judaism, prevention. Maimonides, in his treatise Hilchot Deot in his Mishnah Torah, has an entire chapter about the importance of prevention in disease. And he sees prevention as a mandatory part of Jewish law, coupled with the mandate to heal and the general scientific permissiveness of the Jewish attitude, the idea of co-creation and intervening in the world being a Jewish value, not something we shy away from as some other religions do. The questions of whether to use this technology, were it to be shown to be safe, were it to be shown to be effective in human beings to cure disease, seems to be a pretty simple question for us as Jews, which is, yes, if we could intervene genetically to cure diabetes, to prevent Tay-Sachs, insofar as we're not intervening in the germline, I think that is something that, under the right circumstances, Judaism could support. It's still an open question, the degree to which that will be safe in humans, and as Sam suggests, it's going to take time before we know. But of course, the more difficult question, and the one we like to spend more time on because it's ethically juicier, is the question of how we intervene and should we intervene in ways that change our basic nature such that it is passed on over time, not for disease remediation, but for other goals, whether they're aesthetic or have other reasons that we do them. And germline engineering is passed down to offspring. And to talk about that, and also to talk about somatic therapies, I want to take a quick detour and then come back to some deeper questions, hopefully, at the end. We Jews have a long and complicated relationship to our physicality, to our bodies. We have the reputation, we like to think of ourselves as being pro-medicine, pro-health, pro-intervention, pro-scientist, and compared to some other religious traditions, we are. We think of ourselves as body positive, as sexuality positive, and it's true that in some ways Judaism did reject the sharp Hellenic and later Christian dualism of body and soul, and does have a generally positive and kind of integrative approach to the body and its function. But that's not the same thing as saying that we don't struggle ideologically and through our practice to reconcile innate contradictions of our corporeality, innate struggles with how we think of ourselves as both spiritual and embodied beings. And that conversation itself has a long history. In the sort of American Jewish community, one of the seminal moments was the publication of the book People of the Body by Howard Eilberg Schwartz. And it was part of an ongoing dialogue in academia about embodiment that came primarily out of the feminist literature and started a broader conversation about the idea of us being embodied beings, and then in Judaism about how Judaism itself can help us think about that physicality that we all live in. So let me begin with a somewhat familiar story from our tradition, but I think one whose implications we don't always explore in enough depth. Jewish views of the imperfect body realized through a prohibition in Leviticus about which priests, which Kohanim, could approach the temple and become a servant in the temple. So, Leviticus tells us that amongst priests, and here I'm going to read, whosoever man he be that have a blemish, he shall not approach, meaning approaching the temple. So, priests that have blemishes are not permitted to approach the temple. And then they list the blemishes. A blind man, or lame, or he that have anything maimed, or anything too long, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or crook-backed, or a dwarf, or that has his eyes overspread, or is scabbed, or scurvy, or hath his stones crushed, his testicles crushed. No man of the seed of Aaron the priest that hath a blemish shall come to offerings of the Lord made by fire. He has a blemish, he shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God. Now, there are explanations that are given as to why that standard is in the Torah. And there are two general ones that we're not going to be able to get into in any detail, but I want to mention them because I think they're instructive. The first, and one that you hear very often talked about, and the explanation that I always heard when I was at yeshiva for many years, that I heard in yeshiva, was that it's really a metaphor. It's a symbol of a kind of purity, the human ideal, and that these kinds of deformities are metaphors for spiritual deformities, and they represent a model of human perfection that's appropriate for anyone who wants to be a conduit between God and the people. Imperfection is not appropriate when channeling the divine. That explanation is symbolic, it's philosophical, it reflects the idea that Hashem's perfection needs somehow to have in its transmission to us some kind of symbol of that perfection embodied by the priest. But the second interpretation of that, I think, is a good lesson for us as we think about this idea of how we might change our own embodiment. It was articulated in a beautiful drash given by Rabbi Sam Rotenberg a rabbi who himself has a tic disorder. He pointed out that even after the destruction of the temple, we still had priests give the priestly blessing in synagogues, what's called duchening, where they would cover themselves with a talus and they would give the blessing to the people. Yet the Talmud teaches us that even when duchening, the temple is not there anymore. This is a blessing. Yet priests with problems of the hands, feet, or face cannot give that blessing. So that ideal continued on after the destruction of the temple. But what's the reason given? A different reason is given in the Talmud. It's not purity or the need for perfection when channeling the divine. It is that that kind of deformity is seen as too distracting for the people for them to feel the sanctity of the blessing. It moves the reason from philosophy to psychology and from the nature of the priest to the reaction of the congregation. Incidentally, around the 13th century, the Book of Education, a book written about how to think about Jewish rituals and issues, they also mention in that book in the 13th century why blemished priests are unsuited for temple service. And they say since it was a place of beauty and services were held in it designed to inspire visitors, give them thoughts of repentance and closeness to God, a less than physically perfect priest would mar the atmosphere. So they were sort of anticipating, even in the 13th century, this second explanation of the response of the congregation rather than the embodiment of the priest. So it's the human reaction to deformity that makes these priests unsuited to get up in front of the people. We know this, said Rabbi Rotenberg, because of two stories in the Talmud, which I'm not going to tell you, but in both of those stories, it is asked, well, how come this particular individual got up and said the blessing as a priest, even though he has one of those deformities that is supposed to prevent him from doing that? And the answer that is given in the Talmud is because the people knew him. They were used to that deformity. Therefore, it would not distract them from the opportunity to experience the blessing. And Sam Rotenberg, in a beautiful end of his drash, talks about his experience of the same thing. He has a tic disorder, and yet he says his family doesn't even, when he asked his family, they say, we don't even realize it anymore. We don't even notice it. His friends don't notice it anymore. Becoming accustomed to that kind of deformity, becoming accustomed to some change, some difference, deformity in the biblical use of that word, resets our view of that person and changes even the biblical injunction when we become used to that conformity. And that person is then allowed to raise their hands over the congregation. These stories are important because they communicate a very different reason for restrictions of the priest. And Rotenberg tells us ultimately it's a challenge to us. It's a challenge to the community to change the way they see the other in front of them, to train themselves not to let the nature of some difference distract them from the responsibility to see another person in a true encounter. And so, as we enter the age of genetic engineering, we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question of value, and it's a challenging one. Because human genetic engineering ultimately is about design. When we had our first conference on this 30 years or so ago, I don't remember what year it was, at the University of Pennsylvania where I spent most of my career, we called the conference Designing Our Descendants. We use that idea of design, and remember, design has an aesthetic element. Design isn't just about curing disease. It may be also about curing disease, but it also is about some standard of beauty or good that we then apply in how we genetically engineer another. Even the language that we use, though, has those values embedded in it. We talk about genetic engineering. Think of the word engineering. It's a technological word that predisposes us to think of it as a technical act, not an aesthetic act. Or sometimes we talk about gene editing, using that metaphor of the genome as text. All of these words predispose certain ways of seeing this activity and not getting us to the fact that we're fundamentally altering human form and function. It predisposes us to think of these in a technological narrative that's become ubiquitous in our society, that human life and the human body are objects to be quantified, assessed, and designed. And here is the caution, the question we have posed for the last 30 or so years: what will the aesthetic behind that design be? I just heard the other day an argument that we have heard many, many, many times over the last 30 years that goes something like this. Well, I get that it's wrong to genetically engineer someone to be 7 feet tall because you want your child to be 7 feet tall because you want him to be a basketball player. But there's nothing wrong with, if we could do it, and by the way, we can't do any of this yet, but there's nothing wrong with genetically engineering your child to have basic musical ability or basic athletic ability or basic intelligence, because you're just giving him or her capabilities. You're giving them potentials that they can realize or not realize, do or not do. So if it were possible and if it were safe, there would be nothing ethically wrong with giving your children those kinds of potentials go. And you know, somewhere deep in my heart, I see that. And I want my child to have, thank God my child does have musical ability, but, an athletic ability and great intellect. I mean, I want my children to have those things, and there is a great impulse, if I could do that simply and safely, that I would want to do it. But we have to understand that that's a eugenic activity. Eugenics is the activity of choosing what is good and genetically selecting for it. And eugenics means choosing the things we think are good in general for our children and our population. In fact, the Talmud encourages it in its own way. There are all these references in the Talmud to include genetic factors when choosing a mate. It suggests 2 tall people shouldn't get married because they might have a giant as a child. It's cautioned to avoid matings that lead to significant deviation from normal appearance. It's right there in the Talmud, and all of that. But that's not the eugenics of our time, of course. The ability to genetically engineer our offspring means that we can much more specifically choose traits and incarnate them into the flesh of our children. And I'm going to finish with why this disturbs me and what I don't think we take into consideration when we say things like general musical trait, general athletic traits, general intelligence. Those are all good things, so let's go for it. 2 examples. First, Julian Savulescu. Julian Savulescu is a ethicist at Oxford in England, and he wrote a book with a colleague of his on moral enhancement. And his argument is, we know what parts of the brain generate moral thought. We've done that through imaging studies. What if we could enhance those parts of the brain? Wouldn't that be good for everybody? Everybody would be more moral. I say, says Julian, if we could enhance the moral part of the brain genetically or surgically or some way, we should do it. And I think that that's, without thought and impulsively, seems like a good thing to do. But it makes an assumption about the nature of moral decision-making that I think is wrong. And I think Julian's underlying assumption is that if we did that, we would turn people into Western liberal moral decision-makers like Julian Savulescu. When in fact, if you talk to people whose moral perspective we strongly disagree with, if you talk to someone who's Taliban or ISIS, they will give you very moral reasons why they, from their view, why they do what they do. And enhancing their moral center, if you could do that, might just make them much more committed Taliban or much more committed ISIS fighters and not turn them into great Western liberals. And so this idea is part of a way of thinking about this thing that I think is problematic. Let me give you one more example. We have these values of what we think is generally good. But what if they had genetic engineering ability in Victorian England? Or in some other society where the values were different than ours? What would they think is generally a good value? Would they think, for example, delaying menses in their teenage daughters so that they don't get pregnant as teenagers would be a good thing? Let's not have them have any sexual desire till they're married, in their late teens. Let's not have them begin to have procreative ability till we've got them married off. That wouldn't be seen as a violation of their freedom in Victorian England. That would be seen as a generally good thing to the benefit of their children. What values do we incarnate into our children? If we asked our own great thinkers from Jewish history, if we asked Rambam and we asked, Rashi and we asked the Baal Shem Tov, they wouldn't pick general musical ability and general athletic ability. They didn't care about that. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, in what sense do we know that our good traits are in some sense universally good? Or must we admit that they're good for now, for these times in this place, and we don't have the insight, as most people usually don't in the times in which they live, to see beyond the times in which they live and look back on them and say, yes, they thought 100 years ago that these were the right values, but now we know better. And as we embody these values in the flesh of our children, and embody, I mean put into their bodies, their existence will change the nature of society such that we can't just switch it back if we decide it's not good, because society will be altered at that time. So we have to ask the question, what are the consequences of incarnating temporal goods into our germlines to the third and fourth generation? Human intervention comes at a cost that we're generally bad at predicting it. I brought with me this past Sunday's New York Times Magazine. The cover article is, "So the internet didn't turn out the way we hoped." That turns out to be true with technology over and over again. Again, I'm not saying not to use genetic engineering. I'm not saying we shouldn't cure our devastating diseases. I'm saying a simple thing. We enter this realm knowing that we're imperfect and our decisions are imperfect, and that we have to consider a therapy that we're willing to engage in with deep introspection. And if we don't, it is once again to misunderstand the nature of the complexity of this, and to rule and to not understand the problem of unforeseen consequences. It's an old conversation, one we've been having for decades. But we are right now changing the fundamental nature of humanity. Remember, the Chinese scientists that genetically engineered those twins in China did not genetically engineer them to cure a disease they had. He genetically engineered them so they would fit better into the social construct around disease that they were born into. He genetically engineered them for social and aesthetic reasons, not for fundamentally medical reasons. So we're about to change the nature of humanity. Our own tradition has struggled with the nature of embodiment, and I'd like us to continue to struggle with it too. Thanks.
Okay, Yorkers. Let me start our thinking with a story. Consider the case of 6-month-old baby Lila Bloom, one of the 1 in 10,000 babies born with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. She was brought to the clinic where I worked as a clinical ethicist when an alert and anxious grandmother noticed she wasn't turning over. She had brown eyes, a quick smile, and wears a blue t-shirt with Simba the lion on it. Simba is sitting up, but Lila has to be propped because her motor neurons have already failed to stimulate the long muscles of her back. And the ordinary miracle of sitting and running and standing on tiptoes at the window will never happen for her. I met Lila in 1990, and then when the protein that caused this disease was just beginning to be characterized. But our ethical dilemma was how to find funds for a very tiny wheelchair for her impoverished Russian Jewish immigrant parents. Home care, how to do that in her 1-bedroom apartment in the Oakland Flatlands. And because the disease was beginning to affect her breathing, whether or not to intubate her and whether to keep her alive when the disease progressed. Later, in 2003, I met a young scientist, University of Pennsylvania scientist, herself with SMA, a milder form, who gave her presentation from her wheelchair about how the SMN protein worked, how it was lacking in the muscle cells of patients with SMA, like Lila Bloom, the most common genetic disorder, how she was working on a way to use a viral vector to transfer that gene to repair that sequence and her grand dream of genetic medicine. She was just as excited as Sam, just as certain that the viral vector would do the trick. And now in 2019, the FDA has just approved a drug, Zolgensma, that does exactly that, an extraordinary miracle. But there's one catch. One dose of Zolgensma is all you need to cure SMA, to be sure. But that one dose costs, wait for it, $2.1 million. Now let me say that again, $2.1 million. Now the drug may or may not work in what Novartis calls real-world conditions. And it only works for patients less than 2 years of age with SMA and the specific biallelic mutations that work for the survival motor neuron 1 gene. Now there's an alternative drug called Spinraza. This can be taken by people of all ages because sometimes the onset is in adults. It's thought to be less effective. And by the way, it has to be given every year, over and over. And actually, after 10 years, the cost would be $4 million. Now, they figured out this price by economists. A value-based price for Zolgensma was estimated to be between 1.1 million and 2.1 million. Guess which they chose, the higher dose, higher rate, because they figured that they were saving 100,000 to 150,000 per quality-adjusted life year gained. Now, that's a laughable number considering how very little the state actually spends on little girls like Lila, or how much her father made as a janitor. But think again, $2.1 million. So why? Why so expensive? And it's really odd because the research for SMA treatments was funded nearly entirely by you, by taxpayers, by the NIH, who paid the University of Pennsylvania to do research on the protein SMN, the protein whose loss causes the death of these motor neurons. And it was also paid by HHMI, the foundation, full disclosure that I used to be the ethicist for, set up by Howard Hughes to avoid paying taxes on his vast wealth. So in a way, it's another way that ordinary Americans, like us, subsidize the research on this drug. Novartis then acquires the company, and somebody did have to make the drug and buy the hairnets for the workers and whatever. But consider Novartis CEO Vaz Nisserman. Vaz Nisserman, we learned, had a rough year. He only got $10 million in salary this year, down from the $13.7 million his predecessor received. He's quite upset. Or we could say 5 baby-sized doses of a life-saving drug. The chief ethics officer of the company, because I looked it up, by the way, gets $4.34 million, 2 babies worth. I don't say this just to pick on Novartis. Consider these other companies, all created to do gene therapy. Moderna, the CEO, got $59 million a year, every year. Biogene, Chinese company, $27.9 million. Teva, $33 million. And Gilead, which was started by honest UC Berkeley scientists as a nonprofit company to make drugs for malaria, where the CEO got $26 million every year. Now, this story sets for me a very important context for any consideration of Jewish ethics and gene editing. And colleagues, that context is the deep and fundamental injustice that lies just beneath the real glory of modernity. It's an ordinary tragedy we've known about since Isaiah. And since my field of bioethics has long thought of running to Tarshish and not to Nineveh, thinking all the time about gene editing and designer babies and all the many, many cool forms and cool dreams than we've thought about, for instance, the American foster care system, I can tell you we know a lot about this issue. It is one of our favorite things to talk about. So now I want to have you do some work. I want to turn to some texts. You'll notice that New York Jews are prominent on my text sheet as an homage to this audience, and walk you through the long history of the discussion that, as Paul Wolpe said, was a very Jewish-inflected discussion, led by Jews and thought through by Jews, and many, many texts and many, many books. And I've got props, I've got texts ready to go. So, why don't you read for us Maxine Singer, 1973, the first quote. Oh, you have to come on the Unita thing. Here I am being all-inclusive and we have to,
come
the
to
other
you.
audience. Okay, go.
Sure. Maxine Singer, 1973. Scientific developments over the past 2 years make it both reasonable and convenient to generate overlapping sequences, bacteria and animal viruses. Such sequence homologies can then be used in order to combine the diverse molecules by Watson-Crick hydrogen bonding. In this way, new kinds of viruses with biological activity of unpredictable nature may eventually be created. Certain of these hybrid molecules are potentially hazardous to both laboratory workers and the public. We suggest that the academies establish a study committee of appropriate individuals to consider this problem and to recommend specific actions or guidelines should that seem necessary. Related problems, such as the risks involved in large-scale preparation of animal viruses, must also be considered.
So this is a letter written by the very young Assistant Professor Maxine Singer and her husband Dietrich Sohl to the National Academies, the head of the National Academy. This is just a small paragraph of that very long letter, very alarmed because there had been a Gordon conference, a meeting of scientists that said, oh my goodness, we can swap genes, and we can swap genes into E. coli in particular. And because they were so alarmed, they set up, later that year, the Asilomar Conference. And at Asilomar, they debated whether or not it was safe to manipulate genes, to edit genes at all in bacteria. And invited to that conference were lawyers and journalists, and of course the answer to what they should do about it was to do exactly what we've done now. What we just heard about is an expert committee set up by the academies to deliberate. But what was interesting is this set in place a compromise about how to go forward. The research would only be done in level 4 laboratories, very high level security for the work, because people were afraid, so afraid of it, that Cambridge, the city of Cambridge, Boston, Cambridge, banned this research. Right? It was on the charter of the city. They couldn't do genetic modification in the city of Cambridge because they thought it was dangerous. Just to do it, not in people, just the first gestures towards this. So it's really interesting that this began a debate that led to genetic research being the most highly regulated type of research science in the United States. Genetic research far more regulated than surgical interventions, than surgical series, far more regulated, as we know, than even drug trials. Then certainly more than device trials, because this Maxine Singer and her colleagues set in place a recombinant DNA advisory committee that lasted for the next, until 2016. I was on the RAC, it was called the RAC, and many bioethicists served time on the RAC. And what we did is every single proposal that proposed doing genetic editing in any human being had to go before this special committee set up by this gesture to hear whether it was ethical or not. We looked at the consent forms, we looked at the trials, and this was all because the scientists were sure that they could edit the genome of human persons, somatically and maybe even in the future do the germline, but it was very highly reviewed. So the first intervention, starting from there. So from 1973, the same worries, can we do this? Is it ethical? How should we respond? And much of this debate is affected deeply by what we call in ethics the shadow of history. We've talked about this so much that this term is actually events, and you can see it shadowed out on your, adorably enough, it's shadowed out on your text sheet, because the fear was that in fact we were very close to eugenics, we were very close to manipulating the human genome in such a way that people who were disabled, people who were different, people who had genetic variances would be disvalued, and in fact perhaps their lives would be not worth living. And any Jew who's thought anything about the Shoah can tell you in detail how IBM computers, racial catalyzation, monitoring Jewish communities, and then describing Jews as sick, as dangerous to the body politic, was very much a part of National Socialism and its mechanisms of control. To this day, in Jewish communities, based on the work of Lisa Lerman, who did extensive work, even testing for breast cancer, BRCA genes, is seen as threatening in Jewish communities because of this shadow of the Holocaust, the shadow of history. Now, I'm going to read this one because I don't want to make anyone else read this creepy story, but this is from Joseph Goebbels, the only non-Jew on the sheet. Our starting point is not the individual, and we do not subscribe to the view that one should feed the hungry, give a drink to the thirsty, or clothe the naked. Our objectives are entirely different. We must have a healthy people in order to prevail in the world. So at the basis, tied in with the Nazi propaganda machine, with the kind of war that they waged, with the kind of expansionist ideology, was this notion that human beings, inscribed on their bodies, had to be different. And the Jewish inscription was a dangerous one, a threatening one, a diseased one. To the rescue, Hannah Arendt, who I'm currently teaching. Hannah Arendt is such an interesting thinker, and Hannah Arendt raises for us another familiar complaint, one that we spent a lot of time on as well. Hannah Arendt raises the problem that people worry about scientific knowledge and the way it might distort us or limit us. And you just heard Dr. Wolpe say something very similar, channeling Hannah Arendt, another New York Jew, and talking about this fear that we have that something is troubling about what we call the crisis of modernity. And the crisis of modernity has to do with this loss of self, loss of human beings, the basis of humanity. What is the nature of man? And it's something about this fundamental being human, our performance of humanity, our capacity for true moral gestures would be altered if technology sits between us and if the language of the discourse is done by scientists and not by philosophers. So does someone want to come here and read this one? Hey, you just want to do it? You're good at this. You're a humanist. Right? Yeah, but you have to come here for our audience. That's okay.
Hannah Arendt, right? Okay.
Yeah, so it's a good thing to read.
Not without my glasses, though. It's not a good thing. Sorry, everyone. I was caught surprised.
It's like getting an O'Neill. Same basically.
All right. Thank you. The goal of modern science, which eventually and quite literally has led us to the moon, is no longer to augment and order human experiences. It is much rather to discover what lies behind natural phenomena as they reveal themselves to the senses and the mind of man. Had the scientist reflected upon the nature of the human sensory and mental apparatus, had he raised questions such as, what is the nature of man and what should be his stature? What is the goal of science and why does man pursue knowledge? Or even, what is life and what distinguishes human from animal life? He would never have arrived where modern science stands today.
Hannah Arendt, a classicist, and so she likes Socrates above all, Plato grudgingly, Aristotle not much, and how she is Greek is because she doesn't trust the senses. Like Greeks, she doesn't trust the knowledge of the sentence because what really matters is the mind. What matters is the form. So she raises the question of when we think about redemption in terms of embodiment, when we think about changing our embodied nature, do we miss something fundamental? Are we deceived by appearances? And here she says, quite frankly, that's how science works. And it should work that way. She's talking about the moonshot here. She could be talking about genetic engineering. It should work that way. It's great to have people like Sam here who knows how the actual physical world works and what the senses tell us about experimental relationships and how the cause and the effect are related in the actual, as Novartis said, the real world conditions. That's important for us, but it's not all that we need to know about genetic research. On to A.J. Heschel, of course, hero of JTS, who understands more than anyone, I think, about what to do when confronted with significant injustice. He writes in 1970, here he's writing about the problem of racial injustice, but he expands it to a much larger vision. And let's see, Paul, want to read this one? I'm engaging my audience here.
Yes. Heschel. There is immense silent agony in the world, and the task of man is to be a voice for the plundered poor, to prevent the desecration of the soul and the violation of our dream of honesty.
So again, what does Jewish thought bring to this debate? Fundamentally, it's the idea of justice. Now, I see that we have to go faster, so I'm going to go do the Jewish text. Jewish texts, as Paul mentioned to us, are rich with their depictions of healing, and actually they always contradict each other. Yes, Paul, it's true that the priests had to be emblematic of perfection so as not to be distracting, but there's wonderful Talmudic texts about if you give birth to a child and the child looks more like an animal, they have to have a debate about whether you can sacrifice the child because it's basically a cow or whether you can't sacrifice the child because it's a human being, right? So a woman gives birth to an ambiguously looking facial person, and what ends up being important is whether the child has a human face. A very Levinasian moment. I get Levinasian. If the child has a human face, it doesn't matter if they have hoofs or claws or a tail. You just sort of cut off the tail and shine up the little shoes and send them to school. What can I say? So this notion that ordinary people can, in fact, live a productive Jewish life despite their physical differences. If you can't hear, you may be able to testify as a witness. But in every other way, you send your child to school. But key text about the obligation to heal, lifted up for us by Elliot Dorff, of course. This text, this midrash that he finds within a Talmudic story and then extrapolated in other midrashim. They're debating whether or not, the rabbis walk and they debate whether or not farming is ethical. I mean, after all, God gives us rain and God gives us wild plants. What are we doing farming and cutting grapevines, essentially? And they debate about it, and it goes to the farmer, listen, if I didn't plow or sow and fertilize and weed, nothing would sprout. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael said to him, foolish man, just as one does not weed, fertilize, and plow, the trees will not produce fruit, and if fruit is not produced but is not watered or fertilized, it will not live. So too in regards to the body. Drugs and medications are the fertilizer, and the physician is the tiller of the soil. And we've used this many, many times in answer to the question of, well, how come you're healing? How come you're intervening so radically? Doesn't God give you the illness and won't God send you the cure? And the answer the rabbis come up with is absolutely not. God won't send you the cure. He sent you pruning shears, right? And then get to work. Text B is one that many people in bioethics have worked on, and I've worked on this too, that the notion is just as you have to give your neighbor back your ox or your sheep, or his lost computer, or his car, you have to give him back his health. And the gesture of return and repair, fundamental to the act of healing. And finally, in Sanhedrin, there's a discussion about the limits of research. And I've written about this, about what kind of magic is permitted. And there's a debate about the kind of magic that might be permitted. Of course, the rabbis think about magic that might be permitted, think about magic that's impermissible, and then come up with this idea that some actions are entirely permissible, like the one of Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Oshaya, who every Shabbat Eve study the doctrine of creation, the book of creation, which is lost to us, oddly, but by means of which they created a half-grown calf and ate it, veal for Shabbat, right? And it's interesting about this. And so then they go on to debate this. You can radically create something from nothing if you're pious enough. You can create a golem, obviously, as part of this textual tradition in Sanhedrin 67. But then they say you can't make zucchini. You can't flood the market with the zucchini you've made, and that's for a different reason. That's a reason of justice. So yes, you can make things. The issue isn't the making. The issue is the distortion of the market with your magic. And finally, I want to say that we spent many years thinking about these texts and many other texts, repairing Torah's priestly enhancement, and we came up with this book, which I'm going to plug, a book with Paul is in it. Dina Davis has a chapter in it. Many other people who you probably know and love from the conservative movement wrote, because we spent 3 years together listening to wonderful scientists like Sam, like we did tonight, and trying to think about what it meant for us as Jews. And at the end of a first 3-year and then 10-year period, we actually published these articles. The other thing I was a part of, and it shows you that we spent many, many years, is in 2005 and early 90s, the AAAS, American Academy for the Advancement of Science, put together two of its committees, the one on human rights and the one on religion, to come up with this book. When this book was published, about what to do about germline intervening, the stock market went down, actually, because we said, don't do germline interventions. It's not safe. It's just not safe. And we have to think about that problem before we do anything else. We talked about the shadow of history. We talked about the slippery line between enhancement and therapy. And we talked about the dangers of technological thinking, the sociology of the injustice of a healthcare system that already doesn't provide full healthcare in ordinary medication. And what we came up with was this notion of pausing. pausing until the science could be really worked out. Now, I'm an optimist, and anyone who knows me knows I'm a great optimist, and I really hope that this project this time succeeds. And I hope that people like Lila Bloom, not her real name, by the way, we changed those, really can live in a world that not only cares for them and has enough money to provide wheelchairs for them, but really can come up with a cure that's durable. Of course, that any rational philosopher wants to support science because it's a genuine human moral gesture. But like all human moral gestures, it always needs corrections. The AAAS in this book suggested that we ask 4 questions of any new research, especially this one. Are there reasons in principle why performing the basic research should be impermissible? Just during the research, not the application. Is there anything that would prohibit that kind of knowledge? Is there any knowledge that was forbidden to us? In the Jewish tradition, the answer is no. Everything is permitted in order to learn. Second question. What contextual factors should be taken into account, and do any of these prevent development and use of the research? And there it gets more interesting, right? Maybe we live in a world that is so deeply unfair already, where Medicaid not only doesn't pay for advanced $2.1 million treatments, but doesn't pay for ordinary antidepressants. If we live in a world that's so riven by race and class anger and hatred, that at this moment, introducing a technology that would fundamentally make the babies of the wealthy healthier and stronger against the babies of the poor might be impermissible, even though in some other fantasized world, it might be completely permissible. And that really cuts against a Kantian categorical imperative approach. Maybe there's some communities where something like this would be permissible. I don't live in one. I live in this country, and that's what's problematic, so that we have a heightened level of concern. Not a prohibition, a heightened level of concern. The third question we have to ask is, what purposes, techniques, or applications are permissible, and under what circumstances? For example, any embryo editing has to take place in a context of in vitro fertilization, of externalizing the reproductive process. Right, because you can't get to the embryos inside of a woman's body. You have to take them out, fertilize them, have the fertilized embryos all lined up. And then, of course, you could choose an embryo, in most cases, that doesn't have the affliction, rather than choosing one that does and trying to change it. Right, a very tricky and difficult process. So it's very hard for us to come up with things that would really be needed in this way. Of course, you can do this with Tay-Sachs, you can do this with many single-point mutations. As Paul's project expands, many more diseases can be tested for. You're already taking them out to use it. You're not interfering with the reproductive process. So it's an interesting thing to worry about, to think about. Finally, how do you regulate it? What procedures, structures involving what policies should be used to decide on an appropriate techniques and uses? Who's in charge? Right? I like Western morality, and I stand with Hannah Arendt and Immanuel Kant in thinking that there are things that we can agree on because we're human beings, and one of them is thinking rationally. One of them is thinking rationally, and one of them is rejecting hysteria around these interventions. Hysteria, says Hannah Arendt, or emotion, says Hannah Arendt, or gut feelings is only an indication of conformity. It's not an indication of morality. So we have some hard work to do. And that means people in other traditions, including radical Islam, including fundamentalist Christianity, we need to talk together and think together in what Hannah Arendt calls the space of appearing, these public fora. Because I do think we can come to some understanding, because why? All of these take place in the bodies of women who have to get pregnant and bear the children they will love. And that really, for me, creates the possibility for the moral authority of simple human discourse. I believe this could work. And I was heartened by the good news that you spoke of, Sam, the 2 trials. One, the sickle cell trial, 2 people really seemed to be stably cured of sickle cell. It's an amazing thing. And actually very important that the target was an oppressed community, because sickle cell disproportionately affects African Americans. Secondly, a trial that was safe at the University of Pennsylvania, who takes a lot of heat from bioethicists because of their history of making a terrible, fatal mistake with gene therapy, with using viruses, they proved an intervention as safe for childhood cancer. And that's a remarkable thing. They were modest, they were not hyping it, they said this is safe, and then they're going to proceed. Exactly what we've been saying for 30 years about how scientists should act. But there was some very bad news. The idea that you could fix muscular dystrophy using the dystrophin gene, which we thought worked so well. I read the trials. It worked well in beagles. It worked well in animals. It cured the disease in animals. That trial has been halted because there was 2 serious adverse incidents. One initially in May, the trial was changed a little, and then it happened again. Clearly, there are off-target effects. Clearly, there are mosaic accounts. So we're working it out. And that's what you do as a bioethicist. I love the successful stories. I really hope that it is a change, like immunotherapy has been for cancer. I pray for that, actually. But I also want to be alert to the patients that are harmed and make sure that their voices and their stories are heard as well. One thing we can all agree on, and we fundamentally agree on, and it comes directly from our sources, is the centrality of the need to argue. That's how Jews think. And you can only argue in a public space. And I want to thank JTS and all of the leadership who did this and organized this so that we can come and argue in public with you, with our texts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists for amazing talks. Following Laurie's suggestion, I want to now create some arguments, hopefully, in the minutes that we have. An issue that you each touched on, but didn't explore in depth, that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about, is this distinction that Laurie gave a name between therapeutic and eugenic therapies or treatments. Right. Sam, when you started, you talked about when you gave this analysis, or you gave an allegory, metaphor for thinking about this. You said, imagine you misspelled, right, and you fix it, right? That obviously relies on an idea that there's a proper way of spelling things, and you get it wrong and you fix it, right? And Paul, you offer us an argument for thinking about why we wouldn't want to give generalized capacities that we think are good to our descendants. And Laurie, as I said, you gave us a name for thinking about this. I'd like to ask each of you to think about, or to offer some thoughts about, how do we distinguish between gene treatments that are focused on curing diseases and those which are enhancements, and how do we draw that line?
So before the dystrophin trial failed, it looks like it's failed for now, I was really interested in this idea that you could give a gene to strengthen muscles. And I thought the interesting thing about this wasn't the safety. I assumed it was safe because I'm an optimist. I thought it was interesting to say, how far would you go with this? Could you give this to frail elderly people, like I'm increasingly becoming, right? Could I take it because I'm unhappy with how slowly I'm running? How bad is that? Does that destroy Western civilization? Well, no, right? It's a bit of an enhancement, but, I could make the case that elderly people could, being healthier, not falling, whatever. Do you give it to astronauts? Both Paul and I worked at NASA, we're still there on the ethics panel. We had to think about this. How far do you use these things to change their bodies so that they're more resistant to radiation or something? That seems kind of like in the realm of medicine too, maybe. And then you think, well, can athletes use it? I mean, Simone Biles, isn't that fantastic? Wouldn't it be cool if more people could do all that things? And and then suddenly, now you're thinking about enhancement. And parents haven't done so well with it. Normally, I like all these decisions to be in the hands of parents because the state is so clumsy. But parents have not done very well with it. By and large, it's been okay.
What do you mean parents haven't done well with it?
Using medicine and technologies to give more capacity to their children, and cheating a little bit to give their children advantage. So we'd have to sort of work through what the rules would be, especially in the relationship of parents, wealthy parents, and their children. Because we just saw the entire college admission scandal. That's is an unbelievable example of using your power and position for advantage. And that impulse, that desire, is it's very common, and it comes out of your love. And the desires for love are always the dangerous ones in some ways.
So we've talked for a long time about the difference between therapy and enhancement, and there's an enormous gray area between those two things, and you can't draw a line and say this is therapy and this is enhancement, except perhaps at the real ends of that spectrum. But what I'm trying to do in my comments about giving children general capacity and things like that is not to say we shouldn't do these things, but we have to make them seem more problematic than they are, than we think they are. And I think Laurie's comment is a perfect example of that. You don't just give your kids an enhancement and they run faster. There's a whole context around enhancing our children. There are collateral results of enhancing our children, not just in terms of justice, but in terms of all other kinds of things like seeing the solution to difficult problems, to take a pill, or to physically change ourselves instead of working through them. And that may be fine in certain circumstances, but the point is we keep talking about these technologies in isolation of the social, religious, familial, ideological context in which they happen, which is far more complicated than the simple question, is it okay to give my kid an enhancement so they run faster? It's not a simple question. It's not a question outside all kinds of cultural and ideological assumptions about the nature of problems, the natures of solutions, where we should use technology, where we should encourage kids to work harder. It's all wrapped up in a very complex set of social relationships that I don't have time to get into much deeper than this, but the answer to the simple question seems simple, but the answer to the complex question is much more complex.
One thing I would say, I don't know if I have a prescription from this, but when you speak about enhancements, I mean, if you pay for your children to have lessons maybe twice a week, that's probably providing a larger enhancement than what genetics could do for us today or in 10 years or maybe in 50 years. Because there may not be a very strong genetic component to musical talent, but there's a great associated effect from you paying for lessons for your children or private tutoring. So I don't know what that says about whether or not we should do it, but we have massive enhancement opportunities that everyone in this room probably uses every day and every week for their children or themselves. So I think it's not as simple as saying there's a sociological or societal framework and we need to not do certain things because of that, because I think there is no separation between genetic enhancements and other ones. We already actively embrace enhancements in a whole variety of ways.
Yes, there is. There is a major difference between trying to get my child to go to dance lessons to be a better dancer and genetically engineering their body. If that genetic engineering goes down through the generations, I'm incarnating a temporal desire down through multiple generations. I'm all for enhancement.
You want to do one generation enhancement? What if it was just one generation? So you liked so many.
For my kids, that's a difficult question. We don't let our kids do a lot of things. We don't let them test for BRCA. We don't let them do a lot of things because we think the physicality of our children is different than the physicality of an adult. So whether a parent should be allowed to genetically modify their child if it isn't passed down through the germline, that's a complex question. And it's not as simple as yes or no.
So I wear glasses, and I've been wearing them since I was 14, and without them I couldn't drive or
for
draw,
that.
right? So that's absolutely an enhancement. It was Dina Davis over there who once told me a story. It was you about going to your eye doctor and saying, like, 2020 is like, why is it corrected to 2020? Like, I want it better. And that's a really interesting question. I try it every time with my ophthalmologist. Like, can I be just like Ted Williams or something? There's something really better. I can really see further. And there's an internal mechanism within the profession that prohibits it. And so maybe something like that could be built into how geneticists think about these manipulations. But I think you're on a very slippery ground because we want our children to be as healthy and strong as possible, and we give them all sorts of non-genetic interventions. We do that for our parents, we do it for ourselves. Because we have this idea that medicine makes our lives better and we don't like human suffering.
And I'm
will
not
follow
saying we
us.
shouldn't.
Right.
I'm saying we should make it problematic. That is, we
We should
shouldn't.
worry. We're very good.
No, it's not just worry. We need to think about the implications beyond, well, I can make my kid run faster, so I'll do it. These decisions have implications and collateral
But no one-
effects beyond the simplistic way you're presenting them.
Well, I'm not simple. It's not about making your kid run faster. It's everything I do as a scholar of theology and religion is also about making them more moral human beings.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm really interested in that. I just work really hard for my students and my children to make them decent human beings, right? And if they are sick, they can't, right? So then there's all sorts of interventions. That's why it's all the way up to some metrics that you haven't articulated. And that's what's tricky. You don't want them.
Absolutely.
You don't want them to run in a harmful way. You correct their feet and use orthotics so that they run faster and straighter. At a certain point, if instead of putting stuff in their shoes, if you could have a mechanism, we're very far from really doing it. So it's just a rabbinic thought experiment at this point. What we thought we were close to is the dystrophin gene, which I thought we were going to have to right away make a decision about who would have the intervention. The overlay of it costing $2.1 million raises a whole other set of issues about which sorts of parents would have the access to them. And that is sincerely troubling.
Yeah, that's, I would say, my biggest hang-up, whether it's somatic or germline editing, is access. I'll be a little bit provocative. If everyone could access germline editing to avoid a disease that is otherwise unavoidable, I don't see a moral problem with it. But that's not going to happen forever, probably. I mean, we have massive inequalities right now, and any new technology or new medicine is going to just be a new challenge in order to how to mitigate inequality in terms of access and equitability. So I think that's going to be true for any new medicine, whether it's gene editing or a new surgical intervention or a new device. So I absolutely agree. I mean, I think I'm not an expert on that, so I don't know how we solve that problem, but I do agree that whatever new technology we speak about, that's going to have to be a critical problem that we solve.
Well, I'm mindful of the time. Sam, at the very beginning, you held out this hope for developing a unified standard, ethical standard. And Laurie, you told us about the type of argumentation and the number of people that are going to have to be involved in order to hack that out. At this point, I want to invite, I want to broaden the conversation to bring in voices beyond this table. So I want to invite anyone from the audience that has questions or people watching at home to send in your questions. Please come up to the microphone, and if you could keep your questions brief and direct them towards a particular individual or towards everyone, as the case may be.
A question for all of you, actually, and an observation. The question is, at its fullest, what would success in the realm of gene editing look like? The observation is, and I thought about this when I listened to each of you, was this notion of wonder balanced with humility and what that means. And very quickly, I say that because I have 3 children. The eldest, musical, athletic, academically talented. The middle one, autistic. My daughter has other issues. The thing about my autistic son that I would change is the fact that my husband and I won't live forever. That's the only thing I would change about him. And that is, for me, the wonder and the humility. And I just sort of throw that out, but I ask the question about what success would mean.
I mean, for me, it's simple, which is for individuals living with disease, that gene editing for cases where there are no other cures or therapies, or maybe where there could be a better cure or therapy, that gene editing solves that problem. I think if we look like some neurological diseases like Huntington's, where there are absolutely no therapies available today, I mean, I fear to be the kind of person that one day finds out they have the repeat expansion that will cause Huntington's. So I think if we can develop cures for those kinds of conditions, that would be a success for me.
I think we all agree on that. I think gene intervention to cure disease is really the gold ring of this technology. I'm all for that.
And I think that comes directly from Jewish sources as well, along with a commitment to valuing children who have a spontaneous mutation and are befallen with a disease that we couldn't know about, and making sure that they have enough resources and enough access and enough non-discriminatory structures that they aren't discriminated against and that their lives are full and rich and meaningful. And I think that's what we worry about. A future in which there is no disease is impossible. And that yearning for perfection is a good one, but it's also we have to make sure we build into it the capacity to care for people who are going to be befallen.
Absolutely.
And I'm committed to that, and I think everyone would agree with that.
It's extraordinarily impressive, the amount of thought and the time that you have given to these ethical issues. There are computer geniuses out there who have spent their lives dedicated to making the rest of us miserable and have done criminal things that we can't even imagine. What's to stop this kind of thing in the world, the words of today of monetizing and weaponizing and unintended consequences? How will we realistically control what is a genuine, honest approach to making life better?
So all of our technologies have unintended consequences and have collateral damage that they do, all of them. We invented the car. The car allowed, the city used to be the center of manufacturing. The car allowed us to move manufacturing out of the city centers because labor force didn't have to live next to the factory anymore, and our inner cities became bereft and spent a long time, crime-ridden before we reinvented them as the centers of entertainment and headquarters for businesses. My daughter went to George Washington University. At the sidewalk cuts at every intersection at Washington University, on the ground is printed "Look Up," because the kids were walking, looking at their phones, and stepping right out into the intersection. So there are going to be collateral problems. There always are. And part of the evaluation of technology is, first of all, are the benefits of the technology worth the collateral problems? That's a question for every technology. And second of all, how can we mitigate those problems to the degree possible? That's why I showed you that cover of the New York Times Magazine. The internet, remember what people were saying about the internet. It's going to democratize everything. Everyone will have that's not where the internet is today. We have a utopian view of technologies ahead of time. We have a utopian view of this technology. We're going to intervene and cure disease. There will be collateral damage. There will be unintended consequences. There always are. We just need to do and that's why, I'm actually optimistic. I'm actually technophilic. I love these technologies. I spent my life studying them. I'm all for them. I try to draw us back because we really need to examine them in a deep and profound way to try to preempt exactly the kinds of problems you're talking about to the degree that we can.
So just to reassure you a little, I'm on the CDC committee, Centers for Disease Control Committee, that spent 2 years looking at this problem of the weaponization of molecular biology. And we came up with some very clear standards and guidelines for how you train scientists. You're going to have to, at some point, trust that scientists can be trained and can be monitored to be good as much as humanly possible. And that task is really, people are giving a lot of thought to that very issue. The gesture is for human health. You and Jennifer really want to do something about human suffering. And that's a noble and good thing to do. And bioethicists can be very critical, and we should be, but we should never forget that gesture for a noble act should be at the heart of medicine. That's the point of it. That's not millions of dollars, but we should, support you. When it's distorted, either by the marketplace, or by nefarious actors, or by sad accidents, just carelessness, then we're seriously in trouble because we don't have the mechanisms. We don't have a theory of evil in bioethics. So that's the trouble. We think about the good. We don't think about the evil and why it can happen. So that's why we spend a lot of time studying it. That's why Hannah Arendt comes to the party. Right?
Well, I just want to throw in two monkey wrenches into this mix. One of them is human growth hormone that is used therapeutically, but people are now abusing it to give their kids an extra 2 inches. So where are the ethics of that? And the second issue that I want to bring up in terms of germ cell versus just treatment for the individual is epigenetics, which essentially does change the germ cell, so has that potential, so that treating the individual does not necessarily, it's not like Las Vegas that it just stays there. Would you want to comment on that?
Did you listen to the Planet, what is the podcast called? Planet Money? There was just a podcast on the human growth hormone issue. Yeah, so I just listened to this in the car a couple days ago, so I was tempted to bring it up earlier.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, for me, I tend to not, I'm not saying I'm pro-enhancements, I just don't view genetic enhancements as necessarily existing on a different plane as other enhancements. And I find this another example where in our society today, whether it's selecting human growth hormone for your children or Botox for your wrinkles or a number of liposuction for some fat that you don't want. I mean, I think we do have a society that is plenty okay allowing people with the means that would like to access a whole range of enhancements to use them in their life. I'm not using that as an argument that we should enable genetic enhancements, but I think, without having, again, a thesis, I think those are things that were flooding through my head when I heard you, Paul, talking about the enhancement issue, and I don't know what the solution is, but I guess for me, it's not as simple for me as things that would go into the germline are absolutely verboten, and everything else is kind of maybe okay, because as long as it won't pass to the next generation, it's not in the same category. I think for me, it's much more complex than that.
I mean, there's one argument, we could call this the Nishka Faire law argument, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, so what if some rich people enhance their children? Like, really, is that what really we should be worrying about and fussing about? Maybe we should think about malaria. Maybe we should think about foster care. Maybe we should think about gun violence, right? Which is a lot more scary in terms of destroying the social fabric of our communities than rich people abusing some of these technologies. So sometimes I think that, and that's an interesting argument that we could also put forward. People said about IVF, people said about organ transplantation, people said about many new technologies that it was going to be, the end of humanity, the race to the bottom. And, it hasn't been. Enormous numbers of babies have been born using advanced reproductive technology, and they seem fine. Maybe at 50, when they're all 50, something will happen. But so far, it seems like a generous gift for people that people can have children that never could have them before. At the corners, there's abuse, surrogates, or whatever. But there's some bad ideas that evolve. But in general, that's not the main thing. That's not climate change. That's not racism. And maybe we should, if we focused our energy and anxiety around some of the other problems, maybe we would have a more balanced view. So that's a good argument. We should think about that argument sometimes.
I think we'll take one last question.
Oh, no. Why don't they say all three and we won't answer, but they all get the chance to say it?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes.
Go ahead.
So go.
Yeah.
Sure. Very quickly, just given all of these economic implications that you've all spelled out very clearly, what exactly are the social and the political institutional arrangements that might help deal with some of those problems? What have those looked like in the past, and do you see any hope for them in the future?
All the questions.
Okay, I was going to say, what are the limits of defining disease? Like, where does disease end and nature start? And then also, what are the moral implications of changing the germline incorrectly? Like, how do you know that you're doing it in the right way? And so then those implications on using this technology to affect the fetus.
Thank you for a great talk, first and foremost. My question is more towards CRISPR being a technology around the body and versus the mind. Is that if you code, like you use the example of a basketball player who's 7 foot tall, but then what if 50 years nobody cares about basketball? What happens to the mind of that human being that's been created, and then the germline that passes through? Because biologically, Darwin and its evolution, so we have certain cells that carry certain messages all the way through to adapt to different environments all the way through generations all at the same time. Just wondering about that balance between how CRISPR affects the mind in the future potentially. Thanks.
Thank you. So I invite each of you, we'll go in order, to respond to any or all of those questions.
So maybe I don't know a lot about economics of medicine. Just one anecdote, the Gates Foundation, for example, for sickle cell treatments, they've recently gotten involved and committed efforts to kind of bringing down the price for these treatments for parts of Africa and I think underprivileged individuals in the US. So I think this is a problem where the public good and government can get involved and bring prices down in a proactive way. So there are social investments that can be made to mitigate some of those initial high costs. And I think scientists, we feel that most new technological advances will begin and be quite expensive to develop early on, but when momentum picks up and manufacturing of vectors or CRISPR reagents becomes more accessible to more companies and more pharmaceutical companies, then in general, I think the idea is that the trend will bring prices down, and so it will take some time, but what might be $2 million today could be $200,000 tomorrow, and then $20,000 next year. So
it hasn't happened. I'm totally shaking my head, but
so
right. No empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case.
I'm sorry?
There's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case, that the market is the right mechanism for regulating medicine.
Yeah, well, I started by saying I don't know much about this, so you're the expert on that.
Yeah.
So I'm a sociologist, and the question you asked about disease is a profound one that we don't really have time to talk about. Disease has two components, some alteration of physiology or function, and then everyone forgets the second one, the decision by the individual or by the culture that that's an undesirable alteration. And that second one is important because it's culturally and socially determined. And so you have diseases that are diseases in all societies, or injuries that are injuries in all societies because they make functioning in almost any human context difficult. Then you've got a whole series of conditions that are diseases in some societies and not others. And then you've got a whole series of conditions that are diseases in one society and no other society. And yet we keep talking about disease as if it's something that we can easily identify and we all agree upon and we can intervene and fix it. There's an aesthetic and a cultural element to how we are thinking about this that is what worries me more than anything else. We live in a particular society in a particular time that makes particular demands on us, and the ways in which we alter ourselves are to satisfy our lives in that society at that time. And the question I'm really asking us is, let's look at the underlying ways, the underlying judgments we're making, the underlying enhancements we want to have. And one of the ways to think about this that I think is really sort of an analogy is, look at what recreational drugs have been used at different times in the last 50 years. So when I was young, it was when I was in college, it was LSD. We wanted to expand our minds. We wanted to have a certain kind of interaction with each other. We wanted to get out of a certain social constraint. Then after a while, during the Reagan years, it was cocaine, because there was a very business-oriented thing. You can go on and on like that. That is, the culture, what the culture thought was valuable determined what kinds of recreational drugs people took to fit themselves into the culture they found themselves. The same thing is happening with other kinds of enhancement and will happen with our ability to genetically alter ourselves. We will alter ourselves into temporal and culturally specific ways, but those aren't things necessarily that can change and adapt in the next generation, because we will have, in the cases I'm talking about, altered our very physiology. It's different than getting LASIK. So that's, and again, I am not saying that therefore we shouldn't do it. I am making a much simpler claim. Therefore, we should think of it as problematic. And we should examine the assumptions, not just the results. We should examine why we want the enhancements that we want and at what times, because these are things, talk about business, these are things that are being sold to us by the social media as desirable things. They're being sold to us by our economic system as desirable things. And if we could go back to our great sages and ask them whether they thought they were desirable things, they'd probably say no.
So there's a story in the Talmud about a great rabbi who, I'm terrible with names, even theirs, who sees in the marketplace, goes to the marketplace and sees someone selling something, a spice seller who's got this new spice that keeps you young forever. And he says to his students, he says, I think we should go get that spice. And so he goes to the guy, and the guy looks at him in horror and says, no, I'm not going to sell you this. Like, this isn't for you. You're the great rabbi. You're supposed to find meaning in your life, not like buy this stuff. So it's a very sort of, it's like selling dope. And what's interesting about that is the obligations we have both to the theory and to the practice. So I worked my way through graduate school working as a nurse in neonatal intensive care. And that gave me a very firsthand, particular person, one baby by one baby account of what it is to be ill. And that's why whenever we think about the theories of this and how will be changed, and these theories that we love, we can do that. It's thinking sociologically about what does it mean. I keep thinking about individual people who struggle with the horror of pain and of sickness. Sickle cell disease is a horrible, painful disease, life-crippling, and when there's a brain bleed, cognitively destructive. And it is wonderful. It is a miracle that somebody has figured out how to address that. It really is. And I want the special bracha for seeing a scientist, seeing a person of secular learning should be applied. And right now, so not in theory, but right now in practice, the problem we have isn't the abuse of enhancement. It's this tragic lack of funding for people with serious diseases. I work at the University of Chicago, and we only have one insurer that will still cover University of Chicago patients with Medicaid. All the others were too high risk because we have poor people in our neighborhood, and they use a lot of the Medicaid. And so all the HMOs, which are supposed to care for them, have said, not University of Chicago, we're down to one. If that one decides that our people are too sick and too poor and too black, I don't know what's going to happen. The FDA just approved an extraordinary new drug, nasal ketamine, spray ketamine, that really cures significant depression. And we just had a big debate about this. It costs $1,600 a week for this treatment. Medicaid doesn't cover it. Should the University of Chicago come up with the funds to cover it so that people are less desperate and sad and angry about the situation of oppression in which they face? We know stress and oppression is linked to all sorts of physiological accounts, but Medicaid won't pay for that intervention. Maybe it's the right decision. It's really costly, but you put that story against the story of $39 million a year for some of these drug companies, 10, that he feels bad about his mere $10 million. And it's unjust and it's unethical in any system. So I think we have to figure out these issues now. And I hope that we, with our skills, can say, no, libertarian theory of justice, which is the name for that theory, that theory of justice doesn't work in this sphere. Michael Walzer, a great philosopher of justice, teaches us that, in fact, in different spheres of meaning, we need to have different theories of justice. And I strongly believe that a democratic socialist idea about medicine is a single-payer system, and we have to go in that direction. And if we don't go in that direction, we're going to be, and we have these new cool technologies, it's always going to be a deepening of injustice. And so fix the thing right now, and then think about the theory, and then think about science fiction. But right now, we need to fund interventions for the poor, and we need to make sure the poor can have access to them. So your attention to access is exactly the right idea.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our for sharing their wisdom with us tonight. And I want to thank you all for attending and those attending while watching on live stream. I invite everyone to participate in other JTS programs, including online courses. Further information is available just outside, and have a great night. Thank you very much.
So you can have that.
That's a gift for you.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful.